Tonight, we begin with a development that senior diplomats in Washington, Kyiv, and European capitals had feared, anticipated, and urgently raced to prevent. A development that unfolded not over weeks of careful shuttle diplomacy, not over months of back-channel negotiations, but in a single chaotic 48-hour window. 48 hours that turned Vladimir Putin's calculated stonewalling into frantic emergency sessions in the Kremlin. 48 hours that exposed a vulnerability Moscow believed was unbreakable. 48 hours that forced Russian envoys onto planes bound for Miami, demanding immediate concessions they had sworn never to make. What Ukraine and its Western allies did this week crossed a line that Putin had staked his entire war strategy on holding. And when that line cracked, Russia did not respond with defiance. It responded with confusion, concessions, and something analysts rarely hear from the Kremlin: urgency. Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with unity, precision, and overwhelming diplomatic superiority. And tonight, we have the details. We have the intercepted signals from Moscow. We have the leaked summaries from the Miami talks. And for the first time, we have a clearer picture of what Vladimir Putin's peace talks nightmare actually looks like, and how Ukraine just forced Russia to the table in front of the entire world. For months now, there had been signals, not bold declarations from the White House, not triumphant announcements from Kyiv, just subtle indicators that something unprecedented was shifting in the diplomatic landscape surrounding Ukraine. The Trump administration has been aggressive in its push for peace, yes, but they have also been methodical, almost choreographed in their shuttle diplomacy. Envoys crisscrossing capitals, late-night calls between Washington and European leaders, the quiet repositioning of negotiators toward neutral ground. But what set off alarm bells in Moscow this week was that the familiar rhythm of Russian stonewalling suddenly vanished. The usual delays, the predictable demands for maximalist concessions, the surge in battlefield escalations to strengthen bargaining positions, all of that went quiet. And whenever the Kremlin goes quiet on the diplomatic front, history tells us something significant is about to unfold, often against their expectations. Analysts who monitor Russian foreign policy know the indicators well: the movement of high-level envoys to unexpected locations, the sudden consolidation of messaging around constructive engagement, the unexpected willingness to board planes for face-to-face briefings. All of that shifted dramatically in the last 72 hours. Early Friday morning, Western intelligence agencies detected anomalous activity in Russian diplomatic channels, including the activation of backup negotiation protocols that hadn't been used since the failed Istanbul rounds. These are the kinds of emergency signals Moscow only sends when facing imminent strategic surprise or when cornered by momentum they can no longer control. Ukrainian and European negotiators did not immediately know if this fell into desperation, tactical retreat, or something in between. But what they did know was that Russia was scrambling, Putin's inner circle was panicking. And when a nuclear-armed autocracy shifts to urgent diplomatic postures without public bravado, every capital from Washington to Brussels pays attention. Within hours, the reason became clearer. The United States had orchestrated it. Through relentless pressure, unified Western positioning, and a series of concessions that isolated Moscow's objections, Ukraine and its allies had forced Russia's hand. Russian envoy Kirill Dmitriev was en route to Miami not for vague briefings, but for direct engagement on a refined 20-point peace framework that Moscow could no longer dismiss outright. The emergency signals from the Kremlin weren't routine, they weren't symbolic, they were frantic. Senior Russian officials, speaking under anonymity to intermediaries, described the intercepted communications as tense, urgent, unprecedented since the war's early days. Advisors with direct access to Putin were demanding immediate adjustments to positions that no longer held leverage. Their language, adaptable, exploratory, open to painful compromises. But diplomatic momentum only matters if the adversary hesitates before engaging. Russia did not hesitate this time. In fact, their arrival in Miami this weekend marks one of the most significant concessions we've seen from the Kremlin in years. Here's what we know. Within days of the productive Berlin talks, where Ukraine signaled flexibility on NATO aspirations in exchange for ironclad security guarantees, the U.S. presented Moscow with a unified Western proposal so coordinated, so backed by economic and military resolve, that refusal risked total isolation. These weren't isolated feelers. This was an integrated diplomatic package, combining NATO-like protections without formal membership, European-led reconstruction funding, and clear red lines on territorial integrity that Russia believed impossible to enforce. Russia did not probe endlessly. They did not delay. They dispatched Dmitriev immediately. Tonight, multiple sources confirm that Russian representatives engaged U.S. negotiators in Miami on at least a dozen key points from the draft agreement, including security architecture, economic recovery timelines, and mechanisms for monitoring any ceasefire. They discussed that before Putin could fully regroup his hardliners, they engaged before alternative escalation options could solidify. They responded before the West even fully anticipated acceptance. In other words, Ukraine and its allies did not simply negotiate. They reshaped Russia's calculus. They targeted the assumptions that sustained Moscow's war aims, the Kremlin's belief that time was on its side, the expectation that Western unity would fracture under pressure, the conviction that Ukraine would crack first. This is what made the Miami convergence so frantic for Putin. Russian diplomats understood immediately that this was not another stalled round. This was a potential systemic shift. Putin's diplomatic last line wasn't endless vetoes or battlefield grinding. It was the integrated network of delays, demands, and distractions that kept the war indefinite. And the West just pierced it, not recklessly, not unilaterally, but surgically, with unity and precision. They hit the primary objection on NATO membership. They hit the demand for unilateral Ukrainian disarmament. They hit the insistence on permanent territorial concessions. They hit the threat of renewed escalation if talks stalled. They hit the economic leverage Moscow thought it still held over Europe. In other words, the West did not simply present another proposal. They attacked Russia's ability to sustain indefinite war, the diplomatic infrastructure that would have made continued aggression viable. This is what made the emergency sessions in the Kremlin so frantic. Russian hardliners understood immediately that this was not another round of posturing. This was systemic pressure. Putin's last line of diplomatic defense was not endless veto power or battlefield attrition. It was the integrated network of preconditions, red lines, and delaying tactics that kept meaningful negotiations at bay. And Ukraine, backed by a unified West, just dismantled it. Not recklessly, not with empty threats, but surgically. They did not waste time on symbolic gestures. They did not offer vague compromises. They targeted the arteries that kept Moscow's war strategy alive, the belief that Western fatigue would eventually force Kyiv to capitulate on Russian terms. And here is where the story becomes even more significant. Western officials now believe that Russia's recent battlefield escalations, missile barrages on civilian infrastructure, threats of wider mobilization were designed to test whether the new U.S. administration would blink first. Moscow wanted to see whether Trump's deal-making instincts would fracture Allied unity, whether European resolve had weakened after years of energy crises, and whether Ukraine would hesitate under renewed pressure. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine did not hesitate. The United States did not fracture the coalition. Europe did not waver. Their diplomatic package was so precise, so coordinated, that even Russian state media began struggling to spin the Miami engagement as anything other than serious. You do not get the Kremlin's attention this easily. But this week, Ukraine and its allies achieved something remarkable. They demonstrated that they now operate inside Russia's decision-making cycle diplomatically. Analysts speaking under anonymity described Moscow's sudden willingness to engage as a tripwire failure, a way to detect Western weakness before committing to any real concessions. But the West proved that resolve remains intact. Their proposal was not only comprehensive, it was sequenced so masterfully that Russian objections were neutralized point by point before hardliners could mobilize domestic opposition. As reports continued coming in throughout the weekend, we learned more about the scale of this diplomatic operation. Ukrainian negotiators, supported by U.S. and European teams, presented ironclad security guarantees modeled on NATO Article 5 protections without formal membership that Russia had previously dismissed as impossible. They outlined a reconstruction fund exceeding $500 billion with European leadership and private investment that sidelined Moscow's veto threats. They established clear monitoring mechanisms for any ceasefire backed by multinational forces that Russia could not portray as Western aggression. They linked energy security commitments directly to Russian compliance, turning Europe's vulnerability into leverage against the Kremlin. This was not harassment. This was not attrition. This was strategic encirclement. This was diplomatic decapitation. And diplomatic decapitation is the one thing Russia has struggled to overcome since the invasion's earliest failures. For every delaying tactic they have employed, the West has countered with something that renders it obsolete. For every escalation on the ground, Ukraine has identified and neutralized the underlying assumption. This is the reality Russian generals and diplomats warned Putin about, and this is the reality he can no longer ignore. Remember, Russia thought this war would end on its terms. They thought Kyiv would fall in days. They thought Zelenskyy would flee or be captured. They thought NATO would fracture under threat. They thought Western publics would tire after the first winter. But tonight, the exact opposite is true. Ukraine is diplomatically stronger than it was a year ago. Western unity has solidified. NATO has expanded. Russian military losses continue to mount. And the gap between Kremlin propaganda and negotiating reality has never been wider. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerously unpredictable is that Putin's sudden diplomatic scramble unfolded at a time when he is under the most intense internal pressure of the entire war. Hardliners in the Siloviki are furious at any hint of compromise. Oligarchs with frozen assets abroad are whispering that only a negotiated off-ramp can restore their fortunes. Regional governors are quietly warning of unrest if mobilization resumes without visible progress. Military commanders, exhausted by mounting losses, want guarantees that further sacrifice will yield results. And the Russian public, after 3 brutal years of sanctions, casualties, and state media promises that victory was imminent, is growing restless in ways the Kremlin can no longer fully suppress. Putin is juggling all of these fires while staring at a diplomatic proposal that contradicts every public narrative he has sold since February 2022. And when autocratic leaders in that position are forced to the table faster than they anticipated, they do not act from confidence, they act from calculation, they act from vulnerability. They act in ways that can be impulsive, escalatory, or both. Washington's statement tonight, circulated privately to NATO allies, but unmistakable in its tone, was designed to signal that the United States will not tolerate gamesmanship that undermines the Miami process. Senior officials said plainly that Russia's rush to engage, while welcome, must be matched by concrete steps or risk irreversible consequences. That is diplomatic language for something far simpler. We have the momentum and we are not letting go. Britain, France, and Germany issued near identical readouts within hours. The message was unified. The message was unambiguous. This opportunity is yours to seize or yours to lose. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy addressed his nation tonight in a speech that was calm on the surface but carried steel underneath. He said, "They wanted capitulation. We offered them reality." He said, "Every day they delay accepting what the battlefield has already decided, another Russian mother loses a son." And he said, "We are ready for peace, but only a peace that lasts. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are the words of a leader who knows exactly how much leverage his forces and his allies have built. Here is what makes the situation even more volatile. Russia's diplomatic pivot was not isolated. In the same 48-hour window, Russian strategic bombers conducted unscheduled patrols near Alaskan airspace. Submarines increased activity in the North Atlantic. Cyber units probed European energy grids. Disinformation networks flooded social media with claims that Ukraine is secretly preparing offensive operations into Russian territory. When Moscow moves multiple pieces across multiple domains at once, it means something larger is being prepared. It means the Kremlin is buying time. It means Putin may be considering a dramatic gesture, either genuine compromise or a dangerous escalation designed to wreck the talks and rally domestic support. Intelligence analysts are now gaming out several paths for Russia's next move. 1. Putin instructs his envoys to initial a framework agreement in the coming days, accepting phased withdrawal and security guarantees in exchange for sanctions relief. 2. He drags the talks into procedural limbo, betting that Western unity will eventually crack. 3. The one keeping officials awake tonight. He authorizes a major escalatory act, a massive missile barrage, a ground offensive, or something worse to derail the process, blame Ukraine, and reassert control over the narrative at home. But tonight, Ukraine and the West have taken that third option partially off the table. They did not wait for Russian approval. They did not soften their terms. They did not signal hesitation. They forced the pace and forced Moscow to respond. What we are watching now is the ultimate test of Putin's resolve. He wants to see whether the West will flinch if he rattles the saber one more time. Ukraine wants to prove that momentum is irreversible. Washington wants to lock in a deal without rewarding aggression. Europe wants to end the war before another winter of uncertainty. Each side is watching the others. Each hour now carries consequences that echo far beyond conference rooms in Miami. Tonight, sources monitoring Kremlin communications report a surge in encrypted traffic between Putin's residence and top security officials. They describe the tone as tense, divided, and urgent. They say hardliners are pushing for a show of force. They say pragmatists are warning that further escalation risks total isolation. And they say Putin has not yet made his final decision. Ukraine is not waiting. Additional Western air defense systems are already en route. Fresh intelligence sharing protocols have been activated. Diplomatic teams are preparing fallback sanctions packages that would cripple what remains of Russia's war economy. Their message tonight, clear, coordinated, and unflinching, sent Moscow a signal that the old rules no longer apply. As this weekend draws to a close, we expect the first real indications of Putin's choice to emerge. But what we do know is this. The Miami talks have already changed the trajectory of the war. Russia is at the table not because they wanted to be, but because they were forced to be. What happens in the next 72 hours will determine whether this becomes the beginning of the end or the spark for something far more dangerous. Tonight, the Kremlin is quiet. Too quiet. And when the Kremlin is quiet after being dragged to the negotiating table against its will, it means Vladimir Putin is deciding whether to accept defeat on paper or risk everything to avoid it. This story is far from over. In fact, the most perilous chapter may be about to begin. We will be here watching every development as it unfolds. Stay with us.